Today, I'm going to talk about cost of living in the United States versus Scotland. I planned on doing this video about a week ago, but it's been kind of a crazy time in my personal life. But I figured it was past time for me to sit down and just make a quick video talking about the differences. Hopefully this will help if you're moving from the United States over to Scotland, or if you're just curious about the differences in cost of living. I'm going to start by saying that cost of living is highly subjective and will vary from person to person. Of course, it also depends on exactly where you live in the UK. Here in Scotland and really across all of Europe and I guess the whole world, we're currently going through a cost of living crisis. I wish I would have done this video back in 2020 when I moved here because it would have been an even bigger difference in the cost of living. I still think it is significantly cheaper to live here in Scotland or really pretty much anywhere in Europe compared to the United States, but that difference has shrunk just a wee bit over the last year or two. I feel like every time I go to the grocery store, everything has gone up in price, but hopefully I can kind of make this a recurring series or at least do maybe a yearly video on the cost of groceries here in Scotland compared to the United States, and hopefully in the future we'll start to see those prices come down a little bit. With that being said, from my experience living here in Scotland, it is significantly cheaper than living back in Oklahoma where I grew up. One important thing I also want to say is that when you're comparing cost of living, there is a massive difference between living somewhere and visiting somewhere. Many Americans have this crazy idea that Europe is crazy expensive, and probably one of the biggest reasons is the currency exchange rate, but also the fact that they're tourists and their spending habits are a lot different than someone that actually lives here. I've lived here in Scotland for a little bit over 3 years now, and a couple months ago I went to Oklahoma for a week and I knew it was going to be expensive compared to what I was used to here, but I was actually shocked at just how much more expensive it has gotten just in the last 2.5 to 3 years since I left. One quick example is this place in America called Panera Bread. It was actually my first job and it's not the cheapest place in America, but I went there one morning and I just got a coffee and one pastry and my total came to $9.44. That is, I think, about 8 pounds. That is flat out ridiculous. If I went to Greg's here in Scotland, I could get a coffee and a steak bake, which would be like a full breakfast for less than 4 pounds, which is about $4.50, $4.75 right now. When talking about cost of living, of course, the main factors are going to be your rent, utilities, transportation, groceries, and then your monthly bills like your mobile phone or cell phone, internet, things like that. The first part I'm going to address is rent. This is, of course, the biggest variable and the biggest chunk of your monthly expenses. One mistake that people often make is they will compare places like London to Ohio in the United States. That's not a fair comparison. If you compare London to New York City, London is a lot cheaper. If you compare London to Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I grew up, it's not as cheap. Here in the UK, in general, the further north you go, the cheaper rent will be, and some of your other expenses as well. Back in 2017, I lived in Newcastle for about 6 months, which is Northeast England, and for a tiny studio apartment, my monthly rent was £250 a month. That was definitely on the low end of things, but in Tulsa, there's no way that I could get any kind of studio apartment for $250 a month. And even if I could get something close to that, it would not be fit for humans to live in. Here in Scotland, I pay less than £700 a month for my rent. I'm about 30 minutes outside of Glasgow, down by the coast in a beautiful small town. And my house is definitely smaller compared to most 3-bedroom houses in the United States, but it's a nice place. It's good for the kids. It has a front and a backyard, which is not always easy to find. And it's significantly cheaper than any kind of similar house I could find in Tulsa, where I grew up. Whether you are renting or you own your house, you do have to also factor in something called council tax. I like to think of it as kind of like a state or local tax. It goes to your local council and they take care of things like education, road maintenance, rubbish and recycling, parks, etc. I'm not sure about Wales and Northern Ireland, but one benefit of living in Scotland over England is that here in Scotland, residential houses do not have water meters. Your water bill is covered by your council tax. So that is one less bill that you have to worry about living in Scotland compared to living in England. Of course, the next variable will be your utilities, and of course, we've had a massive spike in energy prices just like most, if not all, places in the world. But at least looking up online, it looks like the average monthly cost is probably about 150 to 250 pounds per month for your electric and your gas. Compared to what I used to pay back in the US 3 years ago, that is about on par. It used to be cheaper. Now I would say it's a relatively similar price, at least personally for me. With that being said, I'm comparing utility bills to what I paid 3 years ago. So I'm sure that the utility bills in the United States have increased to where it is still cheaper here in Scotland. One piece of really good news for Americans is that here in really Europe in general, they don't have as big of a problem with monopolies as they do in the United States. In Tulsa, where I grew up, there is one electric company and one gas company. That's your only choice. If you have electric or gas, you have one company that you can go to get it. Back when I moved to England, it was the first time living in the UK, I actually asked someone what the power company was, and they gave me this really weird look. And they were just like, well, choose any of them. And I was like, what are you talking about? What is the power company? And they thought it was really weird that you would only have one power company to choose from, just like I thought it was kind of odd that you could choose from dozens of power companies for the same thing. Next, I'll talk about your mobile or cell phone and internet costs. When you first move here, you are going to be amazed at how cheap it is compared to what you're used to paying in the United States. This ties into that whole monopoly thing. Back in Oklahoma where I grew up, you have one, maybe two companies to choose from when it comes to your home internet service, and you only really have a couple of companies to get your mobile service through. There are some third-party companies that kind of lease the lines of the big three carriers, but they're typically pretty garbage for service and cost is still not that cheap. At one point, I lived in a suburb of Tulsa called Broken Arrow, and when I moved there, I went to get my internet service, and coming from Tulsa, I knew I was like, oh, I can get AT&T or I can get Cox Communications for my internet. So I went to AT&T to try to sign up and see if they could get me a good deal. I walked into the store and they said, no, we can't sell you internet service because Cox Communications has a contract with the city. So in that city, Broken Arrow, one of the internet service providers actually had a contract with the city that no other companies were allowed to operate in that city for, I think it was a period of 10 years. I'm not sure if the contract has expired at this point, but that still kind of blows my mind that you would have such an open kind of monopoly, and that does not exist here in the UK. From my understanding, the UK was starting to kind of have a monopoly with internet service, but they made some major changes back in the early 2000s to keep that from happening. I'm not saying it's perfect, but compared to the US, it is much better. So basically, the main internet provider, BT, was forced to split into two independent companies. Openreach was the company that runs and maintains all of the lines and fiber networks. And I could be wrong on the exact specifics, I might be oversimplifying this, but basically Openreach is not allowed to sell the internet service directly to the consumer. What this means is that instead of having one company to get your internet service through, you have dozens of companies and they're all competing with each other for price. And it's really nice when you're looking for internet service because you know that no matter which company you go with, it's the exact same product. So really the main thing that you need to look out for is price. And the cost of home internet here is significantly cheaper than pretty much anything in the US. This is one of those expenses that will be about the same regardless of if you're living in London or in Newcastle or in Glasgow. Pretty much any internet provider here is going to be about 25 pounds a month, 30 pounds a month, something like that. You can get it for more, you might be able to get it for less, but compared to my last internet service provider in the US, in 10 years, I don't think I've ever paid less than $80 to $100 per month for my home internet. And you think internet is good, cell phones or mobiles are so much better here. When I moved here from Tulsa, my monthly cell phone bill for 2 lines was about $200 a month. It was paying for the phones themselves, but it was a fairly decent deal by American standards at the time. The cheapest cell phone bill that I've ever had in the US was Metro PCS. It was a SIM-only plan, and it cost me $45 per month for just the SIM cards. The problem with Metro PCS is that they didn't have their own network. They leased the lines from T-Mobile. So anytime that I was at an event or anywhere where there were loads of people, I was the first person to lose service. And it still cost me $45 a month. I checked the other day, and about $45 pounds a month is the most expensive SIM card that I could get in all of the UK. Most people pay about 8 to 15 pounds a month for their mobile phone. I pay 8 pounds a month for 12 gigabytes of data. I could probably get a cheaper deal if I looked for it. If I went for just 2 or 3 gigs of data, I could get a SIM card for 5 pounds a month, and you would never get anything similar to that in the US. Next up is transportation. America is 100% car focused. You don't ask people if they know how to drive because everyone in America has to drive to get anywhere. Most everyone. If you live in somewhere like New York City, you can get around without a car. I would say New York City is probably the only city in the United States where you don't want or need a car. Pretty much anywhere else has zero or almost zero public transportation. Here in the UK and all of Europe, it is the opposite. For many people, it is easier and better to not own a vehicle. I remember back when I was 15 and I tried to use the bus system in Tulsa, I was basically going about 6 miles down the street to the mall, and it took me about an hour and a half to get there with the bus. I had to take 2 buses and wait for a connection. I really should have just walked, but if it takes you an hour and a half to go 6 miles down the road, you can imagine that that's not going to be an option for most people if they're trying to commute or get errands done. While owning a car is a lot cheaper here in the UK than it is in the United States, of course, not having to have a car can have a massive impact on your monthly expenses. Most Americans can't afford to own their car outright, so most people will probably spend about $300 to $500 per month just for their car payment and insurance, and that doesn't even factor in things like maintenance and petrol. Here where I live, our bus system is frankly abysmal. There's only one line that goes through my town. It's every 30 minutes. If you're trying to get anywhere on a Sunday, good luck. But it still can, for the most part, get me anywhere I need to go. And if I got a monthly bus pass for unlimited use for the general area here, it would run me about 50 pounds a month. If you are anywhere closer to a major city, if you're just in Glasgow, Edinburgh, London, of course, anywhere that's a bigger city, you won't have these same kind of problems that I do, and it'll probably be much more convenient to use a bus than it would be to drive around. Like I talked about in one of my previous videos, food in America is horrendous, but for some reason it is much more expensive than it is here in Scotland. Back in the US, I spent about $500 a month in food for 2 people. Now, I could have shopped for cheaper. I wasn't necessarily the best at cooking every meal from scratch, but it wouldn't necessarily have been much cheaper than the $500 a month that I spent for 2 people. When we first had the kids, of course, they were on formula, and the formula that we had to use was $17 per tin. So with tax, $20 per tin. And they went through about 1 tin a day, day and a half. So we spent about $400 a month just on baby formula. When we moved here, I looked at Aldi and they had tins that were 2 to 3 times the size and they cost £6, which was about $7. As you can see, that is a massive difference in price for people that have kids, and of course the same translates to your normal grocery shopping. Now with this cost of living, our groceries and food costs have definitely risen substantially. I would say when we first moved here, we were spending about £50 a week just on our food, but that included dry goods, cat food, paper towels, toilet paper, pretty much anything. We spent about £50 a week, sometimes less. Now I would say it's closer to 75, maybe £90 a week, but that's still much cheaper than what we spent in the United States. The food quality is much higher and we're eating quite a bit better. With that being said, I know I've gotten some comments from people about my weight loss, and thank you. I've lost about 55 or 60 pounds so far this year, I believe, and I'm interested to see how much further it goes. Speaking of weight loss and health in general, that leads me to probably the #1 reason why cost of living is so much cheaper here in the UK than the United States, and that is called the NHS. Most Americans, if they get sick or they need some sort of health care, they just die. And I'm not even really saying that as a joke, because unfortunately there are many Americans that literally would rather die than be crippled in debt for the rest of their entire life. There are so many Americans that die every day just because they don't have access to basic things like insulin. Here in the United Kingdom, we don't have that problem. Part of my taxes pay the NHS, which is our healthcare system. The crazy thing about that is that most people actually pay less in income taxes here than they do in the United States, but that's all for another video. I'll probably make that one around tax time in the US. So the NHS is by no means perfect. It has its fair share of problems. I have my fair share of experiences that are not ideal, and it definitely needs to be improved. But compared to the United States, it is so much better. Anytime that I need healthcare, I don't have to worry about getting a bill for it. I don't ask how much it costs because it's all free. This is also another benefit of living in Scotland over England, because in England, the one thing that you do have to pay for is your prescriptions. Unless it's some sort of like a chronic illness, there are some exceptions, but most prescriptions in England, you have to pay for. They are capped at, I believe it's £9.70 per prescription. So it's still a hell of a lot cheaper than the United States, but you do still have to pay something for it. And here in Scotland, all your prescriptions are always free no matter what they are. I remember back in the US having to pay a monthly premium for my healthcare every month and not really getting any kind of a benefit out of it. Most Americans have a really high deductible where they're going to pay monthly for their health insurance, but then it doesn't cover anything until they've spent like $5,000 for the year. Even if you go to just a standard doctor's visit, you have your copay, which is anywhere from like $30 to $75 or more, and you pay that regardless of what your health insurance says for most people. One of my jobs, it was actually a really good job by American standards. It was a union job, one of the biggest companies in the United States, and it had really good health coverage. I still paid a little bit over $500 a month in coverage for 2 people. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe, share, hit notifications, all of that stuff that every YouTuber says. It really does help the channel out. If you have any questions, leave a comment. I will try to answer as many as I can in future videos. And who knows, maybe at some point, maybe I'll be at weekly uploads, or maybe more than once a week, who knows. But thank you for all your support, and that's it. I'll see you guys next time.